time for the next session, and strap yourself in, intellectually, and a little bit literally, because we're going to be treated to a session which is going to blow your hair back with the founder of Riversimple, Hugo Spowers, who is not just pioneering the world's first independent hydrogen car brand, again called Riversimple, and one of his cars, the Rasa, is parked out front of the museum, and he's going to be interviewed by Pamela Cox, who's the head of the sociology department at the University of Essex, as well as the Labour Party's prospective parliamentary candidate for Colchester. Right. Woo!
Well, shall we start?
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting us both. And it's great to see First Sight so full on a Saturday morning as the Heritage and Culture portfolio holder. This is wonderful news. Hugo, I've been boning up on hydrogen cars because I did not know much about hydrogen cars before Joanne asked me to take this on. So I'm out of my comfort zone thoroughly. However, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we'll all be learning a lot today. I mean, how many people own a hydrogen car? Right? How many have an aspiration to own such a car? Okay, fine. How many would rather see no hydrogen cars or cars of any kind? Right, a couple. So I thought we'll just see where the audience is with this. So could we start by talking about hydrogen itself as a fuel? This is Hydrogen 101 for a couple of minutes. What does it offer to us in terms of clean energy?
Well, first of all, I'd say that it's important not to think of it as a fuel, because you can't pick it off trees or dig it out of the ground like oil. You've got to generate it like electricity. So it's an energy carrier. So think of it as a parallel energy vector to electricity. And it's able to do things that more efficiently, more effectively than you can do it with electricity. But there are some things that you need electricity for. You can create hydrogen like electricity from virtually any energy source fairly directly. And hydrogen and electricity are two key energy vectors. I believe they're utterly complementary. They're the ideal parallel pair, and it allows us to decarbonize most effectively and as quickly as possible and most sustainably. Yeah. Okay.
And what do we need to do to make hydrogen even cleaner?
Well, we make a lot of hydrogen around the world at the moment for industrial purposes, over 70 million tons. And hydrogen doesn't weigh very much, so 70 million tons is a shed load of hydrogen, it really is. And most of it, 90%, comes from natural gas, so it emits CO2. Curiously, I don't know whether it's true, but Malcolm Turnbull at COP26 was saying that all the world's fertilizer until 1945 was made with green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is hydrogen made without any CO2 emissions. The principal one, or the one it is now assumed to be almost exclusively, is hydrogen made by electrolysis, electricity passed through water, and out comes hydrogen and oxygen. We used to make fertilizer from ammonia from Norway that was made with hydrogen from hydroelectricity electrolyzing water. And it was only post-war that we started using natural gas. So there is a very big movement now to develop a green hydrogen supply chain, which is definitely the end goal. But we do not believe that we need to shift overnight from grey hydrogen made from natural gas to green hydrogen made from electricity. There are other sources of green hydrogen, though. Biomethane, algae that can be bred to emit hydrogen. You can use solar energy directly, concentrating heat with a catalyst to split water. That's not done industrially, but it will be. And we need to have a managed transition. Now, the thing about green hydrogen or grey hydrogen, why I'm putting in a plea for some grey hydrogen, is that we're going to be using natural gas for electricity for a couple of decades at the very least, in the most optimistic scenarios. And it's considered our cleanest form of electricity from fossil fuels. But on the UK grid, that's 49% efficient. If you make hydrogen from natural gas, it's about 75% efficient. So we believe very strongly that we need to be not diverting the green electricity that we haven't got enough of into making hydrogen and displacing natural gas from making hydrogen. We should be putting the green electricity into the grid and displacing natural gas from the grid and using the natural gas to make hydrogen, because you'll decarbonize more quickly and larger scale that way. And obviously, eventually, we've got to be using green sources exclusively.
And sticking with the big picture for now, so that's fascinating to hear that connection between, well, the difference between the natural gas and the electricity issue there. How do we advance that transition, in your view?
The first thing is we shouldn't put everything in lockstep and say, only green hydrogen. We didn't, I think the battery electric, we'll come on to battery cars, of course, and the hydrogen battery debate, but we didn't mandate that we can only drive a battery electric car if you charge it with green electricity. And we shouldn't do the same with green hydrogen. If you do that, you will hobble the development both of hydrogen vehicles and, paradoxically, of green hydrogen production. Because if you put in a big electrolyser, say 10 megawatt electrolyser can produce about 4 tons of green hydrogen a day. But if you say that electrolyser is only going to create green hydrogen, so it can only use green electricity, you're not going to have access to green electricity 24/7. And a report for the Welsh Government last year put a figure of approximately 16 megawatts of electrolyser you would need to deliver the same amount of hydrogen if you're only going to use green electricity. So it means you've got a 60% extra capital cost, because you've got to build redundant capacity because you're not allowed to use grey electricity. And so it slows down the development of green hydrogen, the investment in it. It makes the investment case much weaker. And it also, obviously, of course, makes it harder to deploy hydrogen vehicles.
Sure.
We need a managed process, and we need a bit of both.
Yes. And my understanding of this is that hydrogen is being used more commonly in industry and in, say, aviation and freight, of course, than it is in our homes, to heat our homes and our water, and to run our buses and trains, or to indeed to fuel our cars. So how do we move to that stage, would you say, and then we'll move on to cars?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things there. One is that you're absolutely right to mention homes, because the end game is almost inevitably that our gas grid goes to hydrogen. And we think of that as a very radical move. But in fact, until the mid-60s, our grid was 60% hydrogen anyway. We all ran on town gas, and it came from gasifying coal, which is a really nasty cocktail, but it was more than 50% hydrogen, and it had other things like carbon monoxide in there as well. And so that's going to take a while. There are some utilities who are pushing for a much quicker transition to a hydrogen grid. So, and the more systemically we think about all these things, the more we take a whole system design approach, the quicker, the cheaper, and the more sustainably we actually reach the end game. We cannot continue to look at all the individual problems we have and pick off each one independently. We've got to look at the whole system. The other thing is this focus on HGVs for hydrogen. And the government has reached the conclusion that we need hydrogen for HGVs. And they're absolutely right. But they've reached the right conclusion for completely the wrong reason.
Okay.
It's got absolutely nothing to do with size or weight. And so there's two examples I can use to illustrate that. One is it's easy to make a battery electric HGV if you're happy to do 50 miles a day. But that's not what HGVs do. And it's the range and the uptime the utilization means you have to do it with hydrogen. You haven't got hours available to charge. And the second illustration is that the only mature market for hydrogen vehicles at the moment is in materials handling, forklifts and pallet carriers. Now, a pallet carrier is a tiny device, a man with a joystick standing there with a single pallet. Over 30% of food in America is now moved in the warehousing system by hydrogen. And a pallet carrier is not a big device, so clearly it's not size. Again, it's utilization. And the same applies from the pallet carrier right the way up to HGV. You need hydrogen where you want range, utilization, and spontaneity, flexibility. We absolutely need battery vehicles. We don't argue. It's rather like Patrick actually in the last session talking about livestock as a block. You've got to look at livestock as part of the problem, livestock as part of the solution. And we may have too much livestock, we may have too many cars, but the answer isn't no livestock, it's not no cars either. I mean, I absolutely agree with a couple of hands that went up, that we've got far too many cars. We really have. We've got to rebalance and have much greater emphasis on the mass transport system. But the answer isn't no cars. And we don't argue about solar PV or wind turbines, which one's going to win the renewable energy race. They're just different, and we need them both. And the same is true of batteries and hydrogen. And battery cars are great for short-range applications and regular duty cycles. So if you commute 20 miles a day, 5 days a week, same routine, then there's nothing to beat it. It's the most sustainable solution there is. But the longer the range and the more irregular the duty cycle becomes, the less practical it becomes and the less sustainable it becomes and the more expensive it becomes. And so we often hear that 80% of journeys are less than 20 miles. And that's probably true. And that's absolutely where we should be using battery cars. But what nobody ever points out is the corollary of that, is that 80% of miles are driven in the other 20% of journeys. And that's 80% of the problem. And that's where we need the hydrogen. So it's a mix in all sorts of areas. And home heating as well is, you mentioned that, and home appliances. There's a fight going on between the battery lobby and the hydrogen lobby, and there the train shall meet, and it's just so unconstructive, really. The same's happening in heating, and there's the electric mob saying we need ground source heat pumps, and it's the most efficient way to do things. Hydrogen lobby are saying hydrogen boilers. Now, I think that probably more than 50% should be done electrically, but you can't do it in all instances. And actually, it relies on electricity. So if you have an element of your heating system that's hydrogen, in places where it's much less practical to install ground source heat pumps, you also bring some much more stability to the system, because you can use hydrogen when the green electricity isn't available. When there's excess green electricity, you make hydrogen, and that can be stored and go through the hydrogen boiler in a hybrid system when the electricity isn't available. It gives you much, much greater flexibility. If you try and pick off the whole problem with one solution, rather than 80% of the problem, you probably end up having to put in 4 times the capital cost, as a rule of thumb, to achieve the 100%. If for a quarter of that, you could achieve 80%, and the last 20% you pick off with something else in the hydrogen. This is where the whole system approach is so important, rather than try and tackle each problem alone.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to the car now. There's a car parked outside the front. Tell us how that came to be there, how it came to be developed. What's the long story?
It's quite a long story.
It's all right. We've got time.
But brief. I mean, I used to be in motorsport, designing racing cars, and I was interested in the environment long before I was interested in cars. But I used to defend my interest and my participation in motorsport over dinner with friends on the basis the quickest and cheapest way to improve the efficiency of combustion engines, which I think is absolutely true, and still true, but I reached the conclusion we need to get rid of combustion engines. That didn't really stack up any longer. And I got out, that was 1997, Didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew it was going to be nothing to do with cars. And then I found out about fuel cells, which I'd never heard of before. And a fuel cell, by the way, I should say, is the reverse. It's exactly the same process as electrolysis, but in reverse. So probably all familiar with the school experiment of a beaker of water. You put in water and you put in electricity, and out comes hydrogen and oxygen. You're putting in electricity as an energy source to split the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. And out comes the hydrogen and oxygen. They're both very high energy states. When they combine, they usually go bang. In a fuel cell there, you put the hydrogen and oxygen back into the system and reverse the process, and out comes electricity and water. It's exactly the same process in reverse. It allows the hydrogen and oxygen to combine but without burning, and off comes the energy as electricity instead. It's much more efficient than the combustion engine, and the exhaust obviously is 100.000% water. It's utterly pure. And I found out about this in '97. I started doing an MBA, and I did a commercial feasibility study on the barriers to bring them to market, because I realized that technically it's possible. There's a lot of work to do, but it's predictable, hard grind engineering. The real barriers are to do with people and politics and inertia in our systems. And so I did this commercial feasibility study on how to bring it to market, and more than half my work since then. I set the company up in 2001. We've built 5 generations of car. It's only 2016 we built the first car to go on public roads, though. It's research vehicles until then. And more than half the work in the time has been on not just not on the vehicle, but on the business models and corporate governance to deliver a sustainable solution.
Sure. So let's talk about the business model. What's special about it, in your view? How would you sum that up?
The first thing is probably any car company hopes never to sell a car. So we will only ever sell a service contract, and that the customer will pay a fixed monthly rate for having the use of the car and a mileage rate, and that covers all costs. So it's not just the use of the car and the maintenance, but it includes things like insurance and most particularly the fuel. So it means
like a car club.
Well, it needn't be.
Right.
It can be a car club. We could come back to that because we absolutely believe in car sharing, and it's not surprising that a company set up with an environmental agenda has a business model that's compatible with car sharing. If you sell cars, it's not.
Yeah.
Because it's a pretty threatening trend because you just sell fewer cars. And so the industry is never going to build a car suitable for car sharing. We will, because we're selling mileage, we're not selling cars. It can be your own personal use, and there are some instances where people have intensive enough use that they absolutely need to have their own car, or they're too remote and car club just simply doesn't work. So we believe, again, in a mixed economy in both personal use and shared car use. But it is absolutely not a lease. It's an important thing, because a lease doesn't include all these operating costs. And at the end of a 3-year lease, the industry will just sell those cars into second-hand trade. Leasing is done as a mechanism for the industry to manage demand in the market. And when there's a downturn in the economy, you have a rash of sort of 0% finance deals, persuade people to keep on buying cars, because they need to keep them moving out the factory gates. But it doesn't. If anything, it's to increase the supply of cars. In our case, the two things are: one is the car stays on our balance sheet from the clean sheet of paper when we're designing it, right through to end of life. So we don't sell it at the end of the 3-year contract. We provide a second, a third, a fourth-hand customer. And secondly, we internalize all those operating costs on our P&L. Throughout the life of the car. So we will be paying for the fuel for the life of the car. So it means, because we know this is what the car is being designed for, we will design a completely different sort of car. If you sell cars, unit cost is the be-all and end-all. And the fanatical pursuit of tenths of pennies out of components is remarkable in the automotive. I don't believe there's a product on the planet so remotely as good value for money as a modern motor car, with all the complexity and refinement. it is the most mature industry we've ever had, but it's completely unfit for purpose, unfortunately. In our case, the pricing to the customer is not driven by the build cost of the car. It's driven by the lifetime cost. And it's another example of where we don't pick off every problem at once. We're trying to optimize the lifetime cost. It's the build cost, it's all the operating costs, and it's end of life. And
What is the lifetime of one of these?
Our financial model is over 20-year life. Mm-hmm. The average car life in the UK is 14 and a half years, so people can understand that. We believe actually it'll last longer than that. It's got no moving parts in the car other than the wheels, so there's no lubricants, no oil changes, no mechanical wear. Yep. All the structural materials are in there. It's all composite structure. And the components that do degrade, things like the fuel cell, are designed to be service items. So there's no component that when it fails, it economically takes the car off the road. And we believe the long tail, as the car gets older, the fixed monthly rate that the customer pays goes down. But it's a dynamic pricing model, rather like EasyJet seat pricing. We just want to keep the cars on the road. And the price will come down. We believe it'll level out pretty much after 7 or 8 years. But after 7 or 8 years, people aren't buying for the latest sexy model. They're buying for price, functionality, and reliability. And they couldn't care less how old it is, as long as it's reliable. And furthermore, if you're the fourth-hand user of a 10-year-old car, you will know it's as reliable as a new one, otherwise we wouldn't supply it to you. You're also not liable for any component failure. We are. So it means your costs of driving in a 10-year-old fourth-hand car are still entirely predictable. You're not taking the risk of this component failure taking the car off the road.
Let's talk about price. So if I'm sold, by the way. So how would I, if I was going to sign up tomorrow, how much would it cost me?
We benchmark at the same cost of ownership as a bottom-of-the-range diesel Golf. And we think that for 10,000 miles a year, for the first 3 years of life of a Golf, that works out at between £490 and £550 a month. People aren't used to bundling all the costs and the depreciation and work and so on. And at £295 and 18p a mile, plus VAT, that works out about 500.
Okay, I'll make a note of this.
And we've now got cars in a trial in Monmouthshire with a filling station in Abergavenny, so we've got our first revenue-generating customers as of November.
That was the first?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, yes.
It's not in any way covering our costs, but it is real feedback into developing our service, because we're a service company, really, rather than a manufacturing company.
Yeah. Why Monmouth?
We wanted to be not in our local town. It had to be far enough
Where nobody knew.
So it could bias the feedback we get from the community. Okay. But also, quite frankly, it was a very enlightened chief executive who approached us from Monmouthshire, who wanted to see us trialling there.
Joanne is saying we need it here. So, all right. Okay. Well, take me for a spin afterwards.
I think the important thing about the business model, though, and this is a theme in all our business strategies, is about aligning interests in every relationship we build with every actor in the system, basically. So if you sell cars, you make more money by selling more cars. So your interests are obsolescence and high running costs, the opposite of what the customer wants. The industry makes about a 1,500% markup on spare parts on average. But also, your interest selling more cars, it means you maximize your profit by maximizing resource consumption. And I don't see how we can ever have a sustainable industrial system based on rewarding industry for the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. And the only thing then left is regulation. But because the regulation is designed to contain these externalized costs, all of which maximize profit, industry will then naturally need lobby against the regulations, delay them, water them down, and cheat when they come into force, all of which we've seen of late. And so regulation is a really rubbish way of achieving the outcomes we want. Whereas if you make or turn all these things around into sources of competitive advantage, so that actually efficiency and sustainability become a source of profit, it means that industry will strive to go in that direction as quickly as possible. Because you don't have to regulate business to make more money, because they quite like doing that. And in fact, the regulation ceases to be required. Regulation is only there to rein in the externalities that manufacturers are aiming for.
Let's talk about the governance structure of the company. How is it?
We are still absolutely out and out a for-profit company. I don't believe that we can ever have any serious impact unless you make more money by doing the right thing than business as usual makes them doing the wrong thing. The business model is actually fundamentally more, assuming we do a good job of it, it's more profitable. We harness much more revenue per car. We are rewarded for minimizing resource consumption because we design to recover value at end of life and put it back into the system. It is absolutely a for-profit model. We, though, do want to be focused on delivering the outcomes that we all need and we all seek. And we've got a structure with two classes of shares: equity shares that have no direct voting rights, and voting shares that have no equity rights. And the voting shares, there's only 6 of them, are held by 6 companies representing our 6 critical stakeholders. So they are the investors, the environment, the staff, the customers, the supply chain, and the community. And the community we define as those bodies who have no direct commercial relationship. So bodies interested in road safety or air quality, local government interested in employment and things like that. And to be a successful business, we need to maximize goodwill of all those stakeholders. They all contribute to the success of the business. And you can't maximize goodwill of 5 of them if their interests are subordinated to the 6. So we believe that this delivers a more profitable and a more resilient business. It's no good for day traders who want to maximize volatility in share prices. But for long-term investors, it actually creates a much more profitable and more resilient business. And we believe that this company could never get into a Deepwater Horizon or Dieselgate situation, which is all about taking risks with 5 of those benefit streams in order to maximize the short-term returns to the 6.
That's fascinating.
We couldn't get to that point.
Is that a model that you created?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And that's been a sort of 20-year journey in its own right.
Yeah. Is this being taught in business schools yet? Or are you being hounded for insight?
Yes, and the academic world's took it up much more enthusiastically, really. Although I wouldn't say it's a focus of research, and certainly in the academic world, business schools, that they're not looking at the cutting edge. They don't have a mandate, really, I don't believe, to look at structural flaws in corporate governance. Most academic work is looking at how to make existing corporate governance better. And you don't have a mandate to go to a structural flaw that can't be changed. And the primacy of shareholder value is difficult to retrospectively change in an existing company. But academics are much more enthusiastic uptakers of the ideas. And so I do teach in various places about that. But I wouldn't say it's the way research goes.
Right. And I was interested in your group of stakeholders on the non-equity side. You mentioned environmental stakeholders. How is that group defined, or who takes part there?
At the moment, there are 6 companies limited by guarantee. They're 6 completely independent companies lying outside Riversimple. They're not part of our group of companies, and they each have members and directors and a custodian representative. And we're blessed with some really very eminent custodians. At the moment, some of them are appointed. We want them to gradually become more autonomous. For instance, the customer custodian is an appointment because we don't have customers. Or we do now, but until now, we've been those custodians have been appointed. The environmental group is a very difficult one to work out how we're going to decide the appointment. We don't want it to be centralised. It's got to develop its own autonomy, but equally, you don't want it to be captured by a vocal lobby who want to just shut down the company, because they can't get at VW and stop diesel cars, but you could have that group captured by a vocal group who just wants to get rid of cars altogether, and rather than be part of developing a a sustainable solution. And so, but equally, each of those stakeholders only has 17% vote. So no single stakeholder can block a special resolution in the company. And it builds, as the fundamental dynamic in the system, cooperation as the organizing principle. If you have, as you have in Germany with the Mitbestimmung, 51% control in the supervisory body owned by the shareholders, 49% by the unions, you're embedding confrontation as your fundamental dynamic. We're completely the opposite end of that spectrum. Because if you actually want to object and just dig your heels in and not cooperate, you'll be ignored. The only way to get any change is to cooperate.
Right. Well, we'll come back another time and talk about the governance model, I think. But let's talk about the car and the fuel. And in short, Tesla versus Rasa, who would win?
Very. I mean, Musk has done a great deal to upset the apple cart and embolden politicians to push for change, because what the industry's been saying is not possible clearly is. Having said all that, I think there's an awful lot of things he says that are plain daft and nobody would take seriously if he wasn't so rich. But I think it's a fundamentally good technology applied to completely the wrong solution. And sustainability, again, a whole set of perspectives. Sustainability is much more than CO2. I absolutely believe in the urgency of the climate challenge, but we cannot afford to focus simply on carbon as the metric by which we make our choices, and because we will generate a whole raft of other problems. And in the case of battery electric cars, obviously you've still got to create the energy somewhere, so you may just be displacing emissions. But even if you assume that you can have abundant, carbon-free electricity, then you still need batteries. And batteries are a huge capital resource. And Der Spiegel did a thing a year ago using data from the International Energy Agency. They were showing the global production of all the rarer materials from copper, north of copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, all the rare earths like neodymium, dysprosium. There's quite a long list of pretty weird, arcane materials. And showing the global production in 2020, and if we were to aim to net zero using electric cars, by 2030, we need 13 times the global production of those materials, and 28 times by 2040. And if we do that, we won't have a planet left. I mean, we've got less than 2% of the world's cars running on batteries today, and the battery in a Tesla, for instance, weighs more than our car outside, just the battery. So we even if we learn to recycle these materials, which we don't seem to be able to do at the moment, but I firmly believe we will, and I hope we will, even if we recycle all the batteries in those 2% of cars, 98% of the cars on the planet need new raw materials. So it is absolutely inconceivable that we will go that direction, or we will achieve our outcomes. We need a bit of both. And battery cars for short range only need small batteries. But the delusion about battery cars, and where one of the key differences is that people say that you'll never beat the powertrain efficiency of a battery car. It's 75, 80%. The electricity that you put into the car that gets to the wheel. And that's absolutely true. It's about 45% with a fuel cell car. But I'm not interested in powertrain efficiency. I'm interested in the vehicle efficiency. And actually, the two are not very well correlated. So most petrol cars today are between 19 and 23% efficient in their powertrains. But the MPG of cars varies wildly. So clearly, the two are slightly different things. And the biggest factor is weight, and batteries are heavy. So as you build a battery car for longer range, you need many more batteries. It gets a lot heavier and a lot less efficient. So if you want to sort of, as a broad rule of thumb, if you want twice the range, you need 4 times the batteries. So diminishing returns. And that's why the short-range application is so good. We believe that depending on how you measure efficiency, where you're measuring from, is it electricity or is it from the source like methane or whatever, but we're about the same efficiency as a 200-mile range battery car. As you increase that range, battery cars' efficiency falls off a cliff, whereas our efficiency is utterly unaffected. So for the sort of range to which we become accustomed, we can have a much more efficient hydrogen car. But for short range, battery cars have a key role.
It raises a really challenging question, doesn't it, about where to jump? If you want to move away from a conventional car, do you go to EV, do you wait for hydrogen, and so on? I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. Who would you say are the sector leaders in this, apart from yourself, outside of the UK? Are there places we should look to, or places that inspire you?
Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai are the only people who've really put the money into developing fuel cell cars. There's a perception that battery cars are one. The reason battery cars are perceived to have won is because the industry isn't ready to make anything else. We've had battery cars for over 100 years. The land speed record was broken in 1899 by the battery car. First car to do 100 kilometers an hour. So there's no rocket science in building a battery car. We've got better batteries, but it's easy to put batteries into a car. Fuel cells are a fundamentally new technology. The only people until recently who used it was NASA for the instruments in command capsules. So it's a 1 kilowatt. And they couldn't give a monkeys what the price was. So it's taken a lot of work to get that from 1 kilowatt to 20 or 100 kilowatts for a car at a price that customers can afford. Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai are the only ones who've done that. The European and American manufacturers, by and large, have been throwing money at lobbyists to delay the regulations rather than investing in the future, particularly since 2008, where their focus is absolutely on the quarterly return. They are all, even the ones who say they aren't, they've all got a hydrogen vehicle program, and they are going. And Audi and BMW have got a launch date in a few years' time. It keeps on being pushed back, and Honda and Toyota and Hyundai are on the market now. But they are all trying to squeeze hydrogen into the sort of cars they make, in the business model they've got, through the distribution channel they've got, and specifically in the manufacturing model they've got. And we uniquely have the opportunity of a clean sheet of paper. There's very few advantages to being a startup, I can assure you. But the one big advantage is that you have a clean sheet of paper. You're not constrained by trying to incrementally adapt hydrogen technology to suit a vehicle technology. It was utterly shaped for 100 years by petrol engines. As Lloyd George said, you can't cross a chasm in 2 leaps. When you're going through a step change, trying to do it incrementally is absolutely catastrophic.
Yes. Well, on that note, and on that vision of Lloyd George, chasm in 2 leaps, I'm going to open up for questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, quite a lot of questions here. I'm asked to wait for a mic to get to you. I'll go to the gentleman at the back, please, on the left-hand side. And then I'm coming to the front.
I've got two quick questions. The first is the fuel cell. What call on precious metals and rare earths does that actually have in absolute terms and also relative? And then the second question is, how easy is it to retrofit the filling station footprint with the hydrogen filling capability?
Okay. We have no batteries. We do have some critical materials in the motors, as common to a battery electric car, some rare earth materials in the magnets. The fuel cell itself has about 5 grams of platinum, which is about the same as in a catalytic converter in a conventional car. You have between 3 and 7 grams in a catalytic converter. So we've got about the same amount, but unlike a catalytic converter, it's completely recoverable at end of life. None of it goes out the exhaust pipe, which it does with a catalytic converter. And of course, we own the car and the fuel cell, so it's completely captured in the system. And we have no batteries. In the fuel filling station, there's a business case for developing hydrogen refueling infrastructure, a strong business case. We've got a partnership with a company called Element 2 who are committed to nationwide coverage by 2027. You can replace a petrol pump in a row of pumps with a hydrogen pump. There's one at the Beaconsfield services. It's out of action at the moment because I was there last week. And there are very few of them. But you can put it on a forecourt. And like a petrol pump, it can support thousands of cars. Battery chargers can only support a handful. So if you've got 6 pumps on a small forecourt, you'd need sort of 40 battery chargers. You haven't got room for that. The big thing, though, is that you can't afford the substation to support the battery chargers. So that's why battery charging at scale, at whatever scale, will always need a public subsidy. The hydrogen infrastructure doesn't need a subsidy. What it needs is demand. And so element 2, when we go into meetings with local authorities, they say, look, we're not after a subsidy. We will pay for this. What we need is demand. So any subsidies available, please put it into vehicles. That's where we need the support to get to market. And the critical thing, though, is concentrating demand. So Toyota with their Mirai, it's a great big limo. It's a remarkable bit of engineering. But effectively, they're saying to governments, look, we've done all this work. I know it's cost them over 9 billion, and that's a few years old, that figure. But effectively, they're saying, well, we've done this work, and now we need 300 filling stations to create a market for it. And poor little us at Toyota, we can't afford that. So governments, you've got to pay. Again, it's not a strategy. It's just passing the buck. Whereas if you concentrate demand, and our car is designed for local use, people who operate in a 25-mile radius. And there's over 3 million cars in the UK that fit into that duty cycle. But also, think about Monmouth or any county council, there's refuse collection vehicles, there's local buses, there's last-mile delivery vans. There's all sorts of vehicles that operate in local duty cycles. So we're working with other manufacturers to bring a package of all sorts of different vehicles that could all use hydrogen. And then the critical scale of infrastructure to create a market comes down from 300 to just one filling station. Now, it's a small market, but it's commercially viable. It doesn't need public sector support. And it also fits onto a forecourt, so it doesn't need extra space. Now, if you put in electrolyzing capacity, it does require a little bit of extra space. But it depends how, if it comes like that or if it's delivered gas, which it can be. Ultimately, it'll come through the gas grid, so you don't need any deliveries at all.
Wonderful. So you had a second question.
That was the second.
That was the second question. So apologies. And there was a woman at the front who, yes. Do you want to grab the mic?
Hello, I'm interested in how you predict the growth of electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles over the next decade, and what you think the barriers to growth will be.
Need a very big crystal ball. The inertia behind battery cars is enormous because the industry has to make battery cars, I'm saying. The reason they have to make them is that there's a mandate now. There's various derogations, but essentially it's 95 grams per kilometre as a fleet average for all the cars you make. And for every car over that, for every gram over that, for every car, you pay a €95 fine. So if you make 1 million cars and your fleet average is 105, you pay a €950 million fine. If, on the other hand, you make a zero-emission car, it counts as 3 cars in working out your fleet average. It's called a super credit. So it means that it brings down the fines by more than the loss you make on the battery car. And as I said, they're not ready to make the hydrogen cars. So there's a certain amount of inertia. Having said that, the lithium has gone up over tenfold in the last 12 months. The cost of battery cars, as we have greater volume, the cost is not going to come down, whatever the Daily Mail says. The cost is principally driven by commodity materials. When demand for commodities goes up, the price goes up, not down. And the lead time on mining, new mines, is a good 10 years. So they are running into enormous problems. And I think there's a number of chief executives who hope the shit hits the fan after they've retired. But there is inertia there. There's nothing, on the other hand, to stop hydrogen cars if you've got a viable business model that doesn't require public sector subsidy. And I think that once you enter the market on that basis, there's every reason to believe you'll get more public sector support than we're getting at the moment.
Interesting. Other question. Gentleman just at the front here, too.
I'm going to a car club tomorrow, so you'll be spared me. I'd love to go have the first meeting tomorrow, and I'm sorry I won't be here. I'm sure you're rather relieved. Despite being a reactionary old-timer, I actually own 3 electric vehicles on my phone, on my farm, sorry, a car, a forklift, and a truck. They're all over 20 years old. They all need new batteries, and they're all out of use. And despite the Hindenburg, I'm sure you're onto a winner, and well done, and good all power to your elbow. But presumably you must be quite pleased, and I love people, and I hate the human race, destroying our lovely planet. And so
Might need to hurry you, sir. If you don't
Yes,
mind.
sorry. Yeah, you must take some, and I'm very, very impressed by the McMurtry electric car, which I saw go up the hill at Goodwood, and that was seriously impressive, and the young men with it were seriously impressive, like yourself. Presumably you must be pleased that people like JCB, who's one of our last manufacturing engineers, are also on your wavelength.
Absolutely, yes, and they're using hydrogen as a combustion fuel in modified engines. We know the team very well, actually, and the research director is a great friend. And their end game is fuel cell excavators. They're going through burning hydrogen in combustion engines because it means they can use the same supply chain for making the engines, and they can develop the hydrogen infrastructure, the support for construction sites where their vehicles are used. Also, the environment within which those vehicles work is incredibly demanding, and fuel cells are just a bit too fragile for them at the moment. So they need the fuel cell technology to develop a bit further. But they'll end up in exactly the same place as us. And it's great. It's a great example of a private sector company that, with not being driven by quarterly returns, has been investing for the long term.
You must be terribly grateful that Joseph Cyril Bamford was not persuaded to join British Rail. Good one to do so.
That's a whole other question. Jane, there's somebody I know in the audience there.
Thanks very much. That was fascinating and very enlightening. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, it seems to me you're using a very circular economy model. You know, one of the things that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in their work on the circular economy talks about is this need to move from private ownership to rental and leasing. But how would that work practically? For everybody who wants to make short-term journeys, but also has these occasional long journeys. So have you done work on that kind of vision of this kind of mix? You know, I think one of the messages from this morning has been the mixed use. So it'd be useful if you could discuss that a little bit.
Well, we absolutely believe in a mixture of all the different solutions. So batteries and hydrogen, personal use and shared use. But I should draw a distinction there between personal or shared use and selling the service or selling the product. Because if you want to have your own car in your garage at home, you can take a contract from us for 3 years and you can regard it as your car. 90% of cars in the UK, new cars, are bought on finance. Technically, the title belongs to the finance company, not to the person whose car it is. And so there's no difference, really. I don't think there's any behaviour change required. But the advantage of this model is A, servitisation, and B, the fact that it does embrace car sharing, which selling a product doesn't. Because when we're not selling cars, we're selling mileage, and if we can sell more mileage with fewer cars, it brings all our costs down. So we can be more competitive, more profitable, cheaper for the customer, etc. And it also brings much more resilient revenue streams, because if you sell cars, your break-even's defined by how many cars you make that year. Our break-even's defined by how many cars we've made in the last 20 years. Because those are the ones generating the revenue, not the ones we make this year. And it means that when you have an economic downturn, people do stop buying cars. So in 2008, a lot of car companies saw a 50% drop in sales. That's a 50% drop in revenue. But when you have a downturn, people don't stop driving. And so our revenues are much more stable in economic cycles. It also builds much more resilient, stickier manufacturing jobs that aren't subject to low labour cost competition from the other side of the world. Because actually the pricing, as I was saying earlier, is based on the lifetime cost. And the labour content of building it is a very, very small percentage of the lifetime cost. If you're selling the car, the labour cost of building it is a significant percentage. And there's a huge advantage for a local manufacturer in policing a car in its local market. It's much easier than a company in Vietnam trying to police a car in the UK that it's then got to get back to recycle at end of life. So it builds much stickier manufacturing jobs that, which gives an asymmetric advantage to local manufacturers.
Well, Hugo, I think on that note, I'm so sorry we're going to have to stop there, but ladies and gentlemen, but thank you so much for giving us some hope.
Thank you.